Not getting any sound. Getting the sound now.
Okay, shall I continue, Chair? Yep.
So shall I just pause? Yeah.
No, it's fine.
Just pause for a moment. So just to welcome everybody again, we're up to item 4. The first things were just procedural items, and item 4 is internal audit quarterly progress reports. Mr. Harrington is reporting. Can we get somebody on who's listening in? Can we get some indication that you actually can hear us now?
Yeah, we can hear you now, Chair.
Super. Okay. Right. You carry on, Mr. Harrington. Sorry.
Okay, so if I just direct you to Appendix 1, page 17. So this is where we've given a no assurance opinion to payments to care providers, and the reason for that is because of the number and type of recommendations made. This was split into 3 areas. One was supplier overpayments, which was triggered after inflationary increases were incorrectly applied. But we also
fees.
Sorry.
Sorry.
We're now getting some Paul Harrington talking.
Yeah, that's what you should have.
Yes, so sorry, this audit was split into 3 areas: supplier overpayments after an overpayment was triggered following inflationary increases which were incorrectly applied. We also looked at payments in advance. These happened during the COVID-19 where payments to providers were switched from payments in arrears to payments in advance between April and November 20. We looked at this time last year, so we again followed it up as part of this review. And the third area we looked at as part of this review was payments on hold and unprocessed invoices, where at the time of our audit, where there was a delay of 2 weeks and approximately a total of 2.3 million and just over 1,000 invoices were on hold / rejected. So the detail was in the report, and the detail is obviously in the appendices attached. But we had a lot of problems in terms of the control environment, the checks and balances which take place, the authorization process, single points of failure, and a number of manual processes which have obviously led to another message come up. Yeah, okay. It's obviously led to a number of problems in terms of one, the overpayment to one care provider, and also as you'll see further on in the report, there's another review which was delayed payments to voluntary sector provider. That's very much, the 2 audit reviews are very, very much interlinked, as I say, but the detail is in the reports. The third area we're reporting on is staff grey fleet vehicle documentation. So this was again given limited assurance. This is where officers use their own vehicle for council business. It's how we then do the checks to ensure that, 1, the officer is fit to drive, has got appropriate driver licence, the vehicle is roadworthy, and that the officer has got appropriate business insurance. So we had a number of concerns in that area. This audit flagged concerns back in 2020, so this is a follow-up, and there's still concerns over the information we hold on 2 databases, one being iTrent, which is the HR system, and one being the fleet management system. So we haven't got on top of who we should be checking and whether we have checked the right number of staff who use their own personal vehicle. So 2 other reviews: housing allocation system.
Pause there before we have 3 things. There are 3 things you mentioned there, which clearly we were conscious members of the committee and others are most keenly interested in. So shall I suggest that we just take each one in turn and just make sure everybody is happy with the question we want to ask? So the first one, and clearly we're all very conscious of this, is the overpayment to the care provider. And we understand, I think, what has happened. I suppose what we're most interested in is the rectification, and obviously the fact that we don't want to ever see a repetition. So committee, do you want to sort of expand on that? No.
I don't know, Chair. I mean, it's obviously very concerning, and it's got a lot of publicity, and the reputation of the council isn't helped by these things. We saw the press release. We talked about transparency there, and like that's obviously a good thing that we have this committee and we look at it and we are transparent, and it's a good job that we have an internal audit department to show up these kind of things. Yeah. And then, but it's incredibly important that we follow them up. We get recommendations, we put them on the tracker, we make sure that they are carried out, but we are kind of in your hands, officers, generally, as regards whether the actions to rectify the issues actually are going to be the right ones, because later down the line we might find that all these actions have been carried out. We hope and trust that over time our financial controls improve, and yet, you know, we do see this kind of thing happening. So, you know, we can't know that those actions that you have suggested, they look reasonable to us, but really we're kind of in your hands there. And the way we can judge it is if we get problems like this, and with external audits show up other kind of problems, and you know this one happened, and yeah, so we've got recommendations, etc., but you know, we just don't want to see them anymore, really.
Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank Paul Harrington and his team for the audit report presented, and in particular the work in identifying the issues over the well-reported overpayment of £1 million to one of our third-party providers in adult social care. You will, I am sure, be pleased to learn that I, for one, will not jump on any bandwagon or apportion blame to gain any political points in this matter, only to say that we as a party fully back and will endorse any measures to bring about stricter governance, more effective controls in process, procedure and approvals workflow in order to significantly reduce risk of this happening again. But even then, we know that where human intervention is needed, sometimes mistakes can be made, such as in this case. The report before us clearly points out failings in the way that inflationary adjustments were made, and that there was a delay in the information being visible to others, whereby the mistake could have been spotted and necessary action taken. It also points out in 2.1 a catalogue of inadequate process and findings that we trust will be addressed and corrected. This mistake was, we understand, down to human error, aided and abetted in part by the software or systems being used, such as the tools to update Mosaic, whereby information was not available to be checked in real time, both of which causes can and are being addressed. We also know this happened against the backdrop of COVID, when working conditions were far from normal, which, whilst not providing an excuse, can certainly shed light on the team working in difficult circumstances and provide some form of mitigation in some respects. We cannot get away from the fact that this was a very serious mistake, and we know mistakes happen. None of us are, after all, perfect, but it's vital that lessons are learned from this unfortunate and regrettable incident, and that the correct steps and procedures are put in place and adhered to, so that no repetition can take place. I'm pleased to learn that any possibility of potential fraud or criminal intention was ruled out, and this was purely judged and found to be a case of human error and poor process. It is also good to learn that the council suffered no financial loss, as all the funds in question were swiftly returned at the first opportunity. I, and I'm sure my colleagues on Reading Borough Council, would join me in terms of publicly thanking the adult social care provider in question for realising the error and returning the significant overspend back to the council. I'm sure we all personally dreamed that one day an extra £1 million would appear in our bank account, and fantasise about how we would handle it. Well, I'm pleased to say that honesty and integrity were brought to bear in this case, and again, our grateful thanks to the provider for acting in such a gracious and honourable manner. I, as a councillor who also sits on ACE committee, fully appreciate the great work that our adult and social care teams do and the excellent working relationships we have built and forged with all our providers, and indeed the value we place on the high quality of service they provide within our community. And these relationships are a true credit to Shona and her team in adult social care, who rightly deserve our thanks and continued support for what they do. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Robinson, very supportive. So I think I've got 2 or 3 other indications. Councillor McCurry, I know you want to speak. What I suggest we do is go to Mr. Carter first, because I think he might be able to answer the questions we might have, and then we'll come back to councillors.
Yes, so I mean, as you just said, Councillor, human error does happen. The key for us is that we need to have robust controls in place so that if that human error does happen, then those controls can prevent a mistake actually occurring. When I first became aware of this overpayment, the first thing I did was to speak to Paul and his team to commission an internal audit investigation so that we could understand what had gone wrong and the control weaknesses that had meant that we hadn't prevented the payment actually happening. I hope all of the members of the committee will agree that this comprehensive report we have tonight actually gives us those answers. So I concur with your comments. I thank Paul and his team for the diligence and the detail that they've gone into in doing this audit. The control weaknesses in here are significant. Nobody should pretend that they're not. But I am satisfied that the manual interventions that have been put in place at the moment and are in place now should prevent such an occurrence happening again. In the longer term, those manual interventions need to be replaced by automated system responses. As you will appreciate, that will take longer term in order a longer term piece of work in order to implement the system changes that we would need in order to automate them. But in the meantime, I'm content with the manual processes which are in place. The good news, as you said, is that there's no evidence of fraud at all in this case and that there's been no financial loss to the council. The other thing I should mention is that subsequent to this, Melissa and myself met up and agreed that we would undertake an audit of similar placements so we could identify if any similar overpayments had occurred. Melissa's team, last time I heard, had done 100 of those audits and no similar overpayments had been identified. Unfortunately, though, there were a few minor errors within there, which means that we're not going to take comfort from the 100 that have been done, and we're going to review all 240 plus similar placements in order that we can give absolute assurance that this was a one-off and that it hasn't happened in any other circumstances. So I hope members of the committee will take comfort from that assurance, and of course, given the fact that this was a no assurance report, internal audit will undertake further reviews of this area in future in order to make sure that the processes that we have introduced are working properly and are robust. Thank you.
Okay, thank you much, Ricardo. I might just bring you in a moment or two, but let's just hear from 1 or 2 other councillors. Councillor McCurry, do you want to go next?
Yes, thanks. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Cheers. Glad to hear that there's a recognition here that that this is a failure of process rather than landing at the feet of an individual. Yes, mistakes happen, but it sounds like that this was a right context for those sorts of mistakes. So glad to hear that we're taking a holistic approach. I guess there's a couple of specific comments on the document with reference to Appendix 1, 2.1.15 on page 19. It says capacity and workload and staffing issues in AP had contributed to being unable to keep on top of issues, etc. And this is a theme that comes up a bit. And I'm just thinking back to a recent policy committee where it was said that the Director of Finance was planning on spending time doing some work for brighter futures for children, and Councillor Stevens was reassured at the time that this was why, given asked at the time whether this was wise given the council's tardy auditing issues. And I guess given this extra context, it seems hard to justify any extra loss of capacity. As a specific question, now referring to the same appendix 2.1.8 on page 18, the overpayment was only discovered when it was brought to the council's attention by the provider. So I guess my question is, with these new processes putting in place, are we confident that these sorts of things will be caught internally in the future, that we don't rely on the recipient or the provider being honest and letting us know? Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Do you want to just comment on that question, Mr. Carter?
Yes, so in terms of my capacity to support AP, I'm now meeting weekly with the AP manager alongside undertaking the
accounts payable
duties. Yeah, the accounts payable manager. And we have put additional capacity into that team. And the latest, Jackie and myself receive a report through the Finance Transformation Board every month about the processing of invoice payments, and the most recent month was the most successful month that we've had in this financial year in terms of processing payments on time. So I'm happy that the capacity is there, both in terms of my ability to manage AP function within Reading Borough Council, and the capacity within the team to actually improve our performance in terms of making payments on time. Just one other point in terms of the identification of the overpayments. Yes, this was identified when the provider told us. If the provider hadn't have notified us, it would have been picked up as part of the budget monitoring process. So it wasn't like we only became aware, we only knew about it because the provider told us. They told us quickly. If they hadn't told us, we'd have picked it up as part of the next month's budget monitoring process. So I want people to have the assurance that it would have been picked up internally. Yeah. Now, of course, that's after the event. And the key in future is to make sure that these things are picked up before the payment is actually made.
Yeah. No, all good points. I think that's imperative. We get that message out, isn't it? That it would have, as you rightly say, been identified, but just a slightly outdated. And also, I think it's a bit of a stretch to say 20% of your personal time is going to impact on an issue like this further down the hierarchy. Okay, should we just ask one or two more questions and then perhaps just bring in other officers? So I think Councillor Emberson.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to ask for you for adult social care colleagues who are here tonight in terms of the recommendations. It's not often we have a no assurance report, and it's quite expected that there would be a lot of recommendations, and I note that there are 18, and I believe nearly half of those have already been completed. But I just wondered, in terms of the target dates, I know that internal audit liaise with management to agree these, just to make sure that completing the others are realistic in the time frame, because I think the latest one to be completed is June, and it's just quite a quick turnaround. And I appreciate various officers are listed as responsible, which is quite pleasing, rather than the responsibility being on one adult social care manager. But I thought it'd be helpful to hear from colleagues in the team in terms of the recommendations and moving forward.
So I think that's probably now your moment.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the report. And yes, obviously we view it very seriously, and that's the reason why we've got the quick turnaround. So we took remedial action immediately, and there is a clear process in place, which I think answers Councillor Roy's question, was about we've put a clear process in place. There are checks and balances around double checking at each stage of the process on a schedule that's been developed, with a finalised check with the report that comes from finance colleagues and adult social care colleagues sitting down with the assistant director to do the final sign off, so that the amounts of money match the report. So all of those things are manual systems, which our director of finance has highlighted we need to get automated. So the reason we've done that is we want to get things sorted as soon as we possibly can. They are big tasks, some of them, and we need to meet with our colleagues sort of from IT to try and check those through, but we're well on progress in terms of getting there. So that's the reason why we want to move it forward quickly.
Very good. Sorry, anything you want to add, or we don't have to? Okay, so who else? Councillor Davis, you want to speak?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Thanks for that answer. I was just reading here. you put a manual process in place. It requires clearly documented evidence, and it's reviewed by a second officer. So you would say that one would say that from outside that obviously any change like that does need 2 pairs of eyes on it, because somebody could easily put the wrong number in, right? With this is Mosaic we're talking about, is it? I mean, it's scarcely believable that Mosaic, Oracle system, does not support workflow like that. That's like 101 payment systems. Like a single person should not be able to type in a number and pay it to someone without somebody else not just sitting in a meeting and having a chat about it and signing it off, but like systematically being able to prove their identity and verify that payment. And it does seem like it's surprising to me that it's not sort of built into the system already.
Do you want to answer that now?
Yes, Councillor Stevens, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Melissa to explain it, because the detail of it is it is outside Mosaic, and Melissa knows it better, so she's probably better to explain to you exactly what the issue is there. Is that okay?
I'm just briefly conscious of everybody, obviously we are focusing on this because it's a big item, and I think it's right to get sunshine and light into it, but obviously we'll move on slightly more quickly after we've been through these 2 or 3 items.
Technology's not working.
Stereophonics.
I have to. Yeah, so without going into a heavily technical explanation, essentially it's around when you're making changes to a provider level or a person level. And if you make changes to a person, so the individual service users, that goes through a workflow, no problem. So those checks and balances are in place. If you're making changes to a provider who serves multiple service users, you want to do that once to the provider, and that's where you need to do it in the admin tool, which is the back end, rather than the front end, which is where the workflow is, and that's where the flaw is.
Councillor Gittings.
I mean, global changes like that can affect more than one supplier. You could argue, and I would argue, it should, even more so, should have careful workflow processes and automated workflow processes applied. But you have identified that, and one would hope that that can be brought in as quickly as possible, because manual processes take people, they slow things down, etc., etc. I'm a big proponent of IT systems, so let's hope that gets implemented as soon as possible.
Yeah, thanks. Somewhat baffled by all this IT talk and back ends and front ends, and I mean, my sort of question really was, I mean, I suppose it's good that we're going over to automation, but there's 2 questions really. One, is there in any automated system there's a danger that it's automated and then it isn't picked up? And 2, I'm just wondering about the actual team. Are they located in the civic centre, or are they located half in the civic centre, half at home? And I suppose my obvious question is there some sort of disconnect? I mean, I'm a great advocate of working at home, but sometimes there can be a disconnect on that if you're not actually in office saying, well, we've got to pay provider B, and is it all correctly signed off? You know what I'm getting at, guys.
So yes, people are working at home and in the civic. The issue is more about the reconciliation at the end. So the important bit is, do the numbers that were put in at the beginning match when they've been through the process at the reconciliation at the end? And so the report comes off finance. The assistant director for operations needs to check that the numbers that were put in at the beginning are on the report that's come out of the system. So in a sense, wherever you were working, the task is still the same. So it doesn't mean because somebody is working at home or not in the office that would happen. It's the process around which it happens, and you have the report and the reconciliation and the sign-off process. So it doesn't mean you have to be sat in the office to do it. I guess probably I'm not understanding. Sorry, Councillor.
Yeah, no, that's fine. No, I get it. No, I mean, it's. I think the main thing is obviously the checks and balances are in place and the recommendations are followed. But you understood the purpose, yes. Because I feel in other areas there can be a disconnect in terms of people just not having the chance to actually talk to each other across desk and says it's okay, you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I absolutely, I agree with, and the process we put in place is, as Councillor Davis, highlights, it is person cumbersome, and that's not the ideal. But even if we put it in an automated system, you still have to have a reconciliation at the end, which is Darren Carter just explained that actually, at our budget monitoring, we would have picked that up, where you still got to do the reconciliation at those stages as well. So it's an add-on rather than a replacement for that.
Nobody else has indicated. I think we've pretty much got to the end of that. So officers, thank you. I appreciate it's uncomfortable for you, but you obviously appreciate we are very keen to understand and support as well. Okay, so I think that's that one. The second comment was the 2.3 million and just over 1,000 invoices that were on hold, rejected at the end of September. It'd be quite useful if somebody just want to amplify on that, just explain to us what that was about, and again, how we've come through that one.
So in terms of how we got to that point, which I think was the question, in terms of the 2,000 invoices. So this was due to the upfront payments, as Paul Harrington mentioned in the report, where we wanted to expedite payments to providers due to COVID. So we paid them based on planned rather than actual. And then the expectation was that they would send their invoices in and that process would be reconciled. And essentially what happened was that those reconciliations were put on hold due to capacity in the teams, which is referenced in the report. And then we've got this backlog of 2,000. So since September, we've had an officer working on it full time to resolve those issues. Clearly not ideal for us, all the providers who have got payments on hold. And as Darren referenced, there's additional capacity in the accounts payable team to resolve those. So we're not quite at the end of those yet. We've done 2/3. The rest are sitting with providers waiting for their clarification, but we're well underway to resolving and releasing that money.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're saying was you were trying to advance payments and be prepayment. Yeah. And I think my understanding was that was all very much to help them through their cash flow problems. So we were absolutely doing the right thing, even if it would cause us more of a problem later on. Okay, yeah. you concur with that, do you? I think it's important also, if anybody's listening, that they understand the council is absolutely operating, working the best intention of all our providers. Again, anybody want to come in on this particular point about the payments on this one? No. Okay, so the third thing that Ms. Herring mentioned was the staff grey fleet documentation. Again, anybody want to comment on that? I mean, the report's there, it's under 2.3. Are we happy that we've understood that? Nothing more on that one? No. Okay,
yeah,
so
I'm just my curiosity really. What is the risk posed by that not having proper controls data? Do you want to summarise? I mean, it's in the document, but you might want to just say.
I suppose the worst case scenario, or the risk, is that a council employee on council business is involved in a fatal accident, hasn't got driving licence, not fit to drive, or doesn't have appropriate insurance. Worst case scenario, corporate manslaughter.
Extremely serious is what you're saying.
Yeah.
But it's not just a back end admin thing. That's what I wanted to make.
Yeah. Okay, so those three, and I think you mentioned two other reports.
Yeah, sorry. So the next one is section 2.4, which is on page 22, which is a housing allocation scheme. That was given reasonable assurance, no problems in that area, no sufficient problems anyway. And then there were two grant fundings which were signed off: local transport plan capital settlement, which fully complied with the grant determination conditions, and cultural recovery fund grants. Then our next page, which is 26, that just shows you the audit plan for the year and where we're currently at. We're roughly on target to complete the plan. And then section 4 covers the work of the corporate investigations team. So it covers grant funding checks we've done, grant funding assurance checks we've done on the business rate grants, housing tenancy investigations, blue badge investigations, and social care investigations.
So just to correct, you say we're on track. So despite all these other diversions and other reports, investigations, you still managed to keep yourself on track with the original programme?
We're very slightly behind, but it's not significant.
Impressive. Good. Okay, no more. Anybody else on the line? Again, if you can monitor. That's McIlroy. Okay, well, thank you for all that. I mean, so we obviously spent quite a lot of time on it, I think rightly so, and that's, welcome that we can appreciate what you've been doing. And then I think the reassurance is that management have understood this and have really taken on board what has happened. So thank you for all those reports. So then we go on to item 5, which is the external quality assessment of internal audit services. So I remember this one about 5 years ago when SIPFA came and did it. I think it sounds like we're ready for a rerun now. Mr. Harrington.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So in order to comply with the public sector internal audit standards, we do a self-assessment, which I report annually as part of my annual assurance report. But in order to fully comply, we have an external assessment once every 5 years. As you say, the last one was approximately 5 years ago. Those 5 years will be up in the summer. So we're looking for SIPFA to come in and do another independent review of the internal audit service to give this committee assurance on the work we do. As part of that review, they'll obviously be looking at our reports, our working papers. They will interview my staff, they will interview myself, and they will also interview members of this committee. That work is due to commence in April, and the report will be presented to the committee at its July meeting.
Okay. I've got a couple of thoughts. Does anyone else want to dive in first?
I don't want to steal your thoughts because I know what they are.
So I suppose my thoughts are, presumably SIPFA's constantly sort of coming up with new ideas about how they're doing business. How do we tap into that to make sure we're up to speed with their current thinking? So they're going to come in presumably and look at us and say, well, jolly good, this is what you're doing, but actually best practices wherever it is. Presumably we want to make sure that whatever we're doing is in line with what is regarded as best practice at the moment. So I'm just intrigued to know how you get a sense of how things have moved on over the last 5 years and what is it they're looking for such that we're already anticipating that and doing it.
Well, best practice is as documented in the public sector internal audit standards. So that is best practice. So every year we do a self-assessment against those standards. So those standards will change, and they change roughly every year. They're amended slightly. So we review the standards and we do a quick self-assessment to make sure that we're complying fully with those standards. But the external assessment will tell us that in black and white. Yes, you are compliant. If there are recommendations to improve, then as of the last review 5 years ago, there were a few recommendations, but on the whole, we got a very, very good, positive inspection. And I hope we repeat that this time round. But obviously, if there are recommendations, then we will implement those recommendations.
Okay, and that's the key point that you've explained there, the actual auditing standards that you're using and so updating each year. So it would be hopefully a surprise if we're wide of the mark because they've been updating those. And I certainly 5 years ago recall that. I think the only issue I remember they were quite concerned about was, I think, particularly composition of the audit committee, which is interesting, and we'll probably pick that up again a bit later when we get to the Redmond review. So they'll be coming in, and I guess you'll be probably wanting to talk to a number of us, almost certainly, so we can stand by for that. Yeah. Okay, any other further comments or thoughts about that item?
Obvious question. Thanks. Obvious question. Their recommendations from 4 years ago. Is it worth circulating those, or just to see that they're not going to come and say we asked you to do X, Y, Z and you haven't done it? I imagine the composition, looking back, was the composition of the committee then? Did it have the leader on it? I think that was probably a recommendation, wasn't it? Fair enough, really. But there might have been others. I don't know.
Yeah, the recommendations we were in control of, they were predominantly advisory recommendations. As I said, we got a very, very good review last time round, but yeah, I'm happy to circulate and confirm that we've implemented those recommendations.
Okay, so that's item 5. Again, assume Councillor McCora, you'll monitor him, Michael, if he wants to speak. So item 6, implementation of the finance improvement programme, and Mr. Tinsell has popped up, so I'm guessing he's about to talk to us.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. The paper presented to you is the committee's regular update on the finance improvement programme. It sets out each of the programme areas and work streams an update. Paragraphs 3 and 4 at the beginning of the report give some background and an introduction. So my approach really is just to give you a quick update on each of the work streams moving forward from the last committee. So as you'll read, the accounts payable is completed now with the monitoring and performance KPIs in place, and we've heard reference to those already this evening. As far as accounts receivable, there are a number of areas that are still under development and being developed. They are the production of a service level agreement, training and user guides for staff, and also looking at the composition of the accounts receivable team. There have been some changes with a realignment of accounts receivable as far as the team's been concerned, and that's now progressing. The chart of accounts workstream is complete, and the reconciliations and final accounts is a subject of a separate paper that you will be taken through by Darren Carter later this evening. The new area that we have introduced this time, following a discussion at the last committee, is an update on the finance system, procurement and implementation, and at section 5.5 within the report is an update. We are in the implementation stage or implementation design stage at the moment. The build of that commences in February, and you'll see the milestones there. Testing takes place and we're completed in August. Training is in September, and the go live is scheduled for the 1st of October. The other element within the report, as you'll have seen, are updates on the audit tracker recommendations that relate to the finance improvement programme. There are now 10. There were 7. If you remember, at the last committee there was a reduction because a number of them have been cleared. There have been 3 additions following recent audit recommendations, which now move the number to 10 from 7, and those 3 new ones relate to bank and cash reconciliations. The report is I think, is self-explanatory. I'm happy to take any questions, Chair.
Any questions from anybody? It might just be, we mentioned this before, Mr. Carter mentioned in a briefing earlier in the week, the tightness of the timetable. I think it's just worth making us very aware of how tight it's going to be in the sort of autumn. And I guess also, how will you report sort of progress towards that that deadline in the 1st of October?
I'll pick that up. So the progress on the implementation of the system, I chair the project board, which meets every couple of weeks. So I sponsor that through the project board. And then we report on progress against the implementation to the transformation board that Jackie Yates chairs. So we have got good reporting mechanisms internally to make sure that we're on track. While the deadlines are tight, there isn't a huge amount of slack in there. We have got a detailed project plan that has been agreed between the council and our system partners for the implementation to deliver on 1st of October. The biggest challenge initially will be the need for RBC officers, including myself and Stuart Donnelly, to actually agree some of the key system design principles, especially around the chart of accounts. That's the biggest initial piece of work that we need to conclude. That needs to be done in the next few weeks, and we're doing that work now. So we will report back regularly to the committee on progress. We'll give an update at each of the committee meetings about progress, but rest assured there is considerable robust challenge about the progress of the implementation of the project.
Speaking of robust challenge.
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to add to Mr. Carter's assurances, we have also brought in additional resource to support the project. So there is a dedicated project manager and a further support in terms of implementation of the system on a technical basis, and that individual has implemented this same system in another local authority very recently. We have also brought in some backfill capacity to release staff in our current financial systems team so that they can focus and work on this project as well. So I think, you know, in terms of releasing capacity, we are doing what we can to make sure that that happens. We've also charged the project team with going back and looking at the timeline, because it was a very linear, one thing has to happen after another, and we all know that some things can run in parallel. Yep. So that is due to come back to the transformation board as well. So we're doing what we can to make sure we hit the deadline, because clearly if we don't, then we have only got so far with the current contract, and then it becomes an additional financial burden. Yeah. But more importantly, the benefits that the system can bring to the wider organisation as well as the finance team are very much needed, and the sooner we can get it in, the better.
Okay. Great. Well, that sounds like a lot of effort's gone into sort of making sure this thing hopefully will arrive on time. A couple of other comments. So, Councillor Davis first, then Councillor Robinson.
No, I mean, I have been involved in these kind of projects over the years, and a couple of points that I might note. One is that I think Jackie pretty much answered that already, is that often these projects require key users from different departments to get involved, who know the organisation well. You can't really hire them because they are to bring tribal knowledge of the organisation into the new system, and sometimes it's difficult to prize them out of their roles because they're busy. You know, they're not spare people, are they? And then you have to backfill them, and you've done that, but you know, you end up with people in there who are new or contractors or something. So it's a thing to look out for. It sounds like you're totally on top of that. And the other thing that often happens is that the outgoing system becomes sort of moribund, and therefore doesn't get any new features and doesn't get maintained properly. And you know, you're still relying on that system until you have the new system. It is your main system until then, and you can find that, you know, some effort needs to go on during implementation, in parallel with the implementation, to making sure that the existing system is still, you know, treated as a key vital part of the organisation, really. And you know, those two things, I would say that those are the things that strike me in these kind of projects that you can fall down on. But there we are.
Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. And I think Councillor Stevens has just touched upon something I was going to mention. Yes, we've got a high-level plan in terms of the new system coming in, but what about the decommissioning of the existing system? Because surely there must be some element of migration or something of that nature that needs to take place. But I see nothing about a plan about decommissioning the existing Oracle Fusion.
Yes, so the plan is that we won't decommission the existing Oracle Fusion. As you're probably aware, the council is required to hold 6 years worth of financial data. And rather than migrating all of that data across to the new financial system, the plan is to have a limited read-only access to Oracle for a continuing period, to allow us to have that access without the need to transfer all of the data for those financial years across to the new financial system. We think that's a sensible solution I mean, as you've just said, data migration is one of the biggest risks in any financial system upgrade, and I think that's a sensible solution. What we will need to do, though, with the mid-year implementation is to migrate the transactional data for the financial year that we're in. So everything from 1st of April to the end of September will need to be migrated across to the new system. And that is clearly one of the most significant work streams that we're working on at the moment.
Okay, any more questions around this? No, so thank you very much, Mr. Tisdall, and again, Mr. Carter, for that one. So one of our big favourites coming up, Treasury Management Strategy, the mid-year review. I assume that's Mr. Carter.
I think I'm presenting that, Chair.
Please do.
So the Council approved a Treasury Management Strategy and Annual Investment Strategy for the current financial year in February 2021. This report updates members on the activity of the Treasury Management function during the first half of this financial year for the period 1st of April to 30th September. And the report confirms that the Council has complied with all elements of the approved Treasury Management Strategy. Council has not taken out any new external long-term borrowing during the financial year as of 30 September, which is the date of this report, nor has any borrowing been taken in the period since. This is largely due to the Council spending less in year in respect to the capital programme than was originally forecast, and it's also due to additional grant income and cash flow support that the Council has received due to COVID-19. Therefore, the Council is currently operating significantly within its prudential indicators relating to capital expenditure and borrowing. There remains a possibility that the Council may need to borrow during the fourth quarter of the financial year, as our cash balances are forecast to reduce during the period due to significant cash flow outgoings. The report contains an updated interest rates forecast following the decision by the Bank of England to raise its base rate to 0.25% in December 21, and our Treasury Management advisors are currently forecasting future increases, each of a further 0.25% in June 2022 and March 23. Finally, I wanted to highlight that the central government launched a new consultation at the end of November, which closes on the 8th of February in respect of the minimum revenue provision that councils must set aside to repay external debt. One of those proposals, if implemented, would require local authorities to provide MRP on any capital loans given to third parties and wholly owned companies. The Council's current MRP policy would therefore need to be reviewed, and any additional budgetary provision made within the Council's revenue budget in order to comply with this change should it materialise. Any changes will not impact on the current nor the next financial year and would not require retrospective adjustment. Thank you, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you for that. So just to be clear, I assume what you're saying is any loans we make to Reading Transport or Brighter Future for Children, currently there's no MRP. There would be if these changes go through.
Right.
That's it, is it? Okay.
On that last point, is there any sort of early idea of what that impact might be? I mean, is that the thing that did for or has affected the strategy for Homes for Reading as well?
Do you want to answer that? I mean, obviously that's a sort of treasury management point as opposed to, I suppose, provision in terms of borrowing. Do you want to go, Mr. Carter?
Yeah. So we've done a calculation at the moment of what the immediate impact would be of providing minimum revenue provision on these loans. But that isn't a comprehensive piece of work yet, because the thing that we now need to do is that previously any capital receipt from the repayment of the loan was effectively used to fund the loan itself, which is why we didn't need to provide MRP on it. In the new circumstances, that capital receipt when the loan was repaid would be available for the council to use to fund ongoing capital expenditure, and therefore reduce our need to borrow, and therefore reduce the need to pay MRP on the schemes that we're now funding through the capital receipt. So what we now need to do is that second piece of work to understand how we would use the capital receipt from the payment of the loan to mitigate the pressure that would arise from the need to pay MRP on the value of those loans. And you were right, the two big areas where we've made loans at the moment aren't Brighter Futures. It is Reading Buses and it is Homes for Reading. So those are the two that would have the most significant impact on us and potentially on the companies.
Well, that's sure the bigger point, isn't it? I mean, probably we're big enough to cope with that, but from their perspective, the cost of borrowing money from us is be significantly greater, and that will impact their investment decisions in terms of replacing, upgrading fleet and so on. And so I think that's going to be the bigger issue to my mind, but correct me if I'm wrong.
So I've already raised this with the Director of Finance and the Chair of the Board at the bus company, so they're fully aware of this. They were aware of it as soon as the
I've got enough problems already. Yeah.
So that will form a key part of our conversations ongoing. And I meet with the Finance Director from the bus company every month, so this is number one, maybe number two on our list of things that we need to address. So yeah, we need to reach a resolution to this by the time we enter 1st of April 2023, either through the council agreeing that we will fund the MRP on these, or the bus company identifying a different source to fund its loans. So we need to do that work now. I mean, as Stuart said, at the moment, this consultation is just consultation. The consultation itself doesn't end until next month. So there's every chance that things might change, and we're going to put forward as part of our consultation response a request that bus companies are excluded from these, from this judgment, because I think the government is keen to have municipal bus companies, and it may be an unintended consequence of them trying to restrict loan payments to other types of companies. They specifically refer to housing companies, and maybe they haven't considered the impact that it would have on bus companies. So the Chief Exec and myself made representation to the LGA before Christmas about that issue, and we will be raising that as part of our response to the consultation.
As ever, these things are quite incredibly complicated because you have a massive operating issue there driven by a treasury issue, but you could see that that wasn't their intention. And I mean, the last thing to do is put bus companies around the country out of business in terms of shifting people to public transport. It's the last thing they want to do, so I suspect they might be quite receptive to that.
We're hopeful.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah. Okay, any more questions about treasury management? No. All right. So thank you very much, Mr. Dolly, for that one. My piece, just one second, my PC has died on me. It's all very well being paperless. So next, that was item 7. So then we go to item 8, which is Q2 performance and monitoring report. Mr. Carter.
Yes. So this report sets out the projected revenue and capital outturn for positions for 21-22 for both the general fund and the housing revenue account. The report itself was actually presented to policy committee in December, and it's the same report presented tonight. There are no differences in terms of the projections. The report also sets out performance against the measures of success published in the council's corporate plan. So just as a reminder for members of the committee who may not have heard me say this at policy committee in December, this report does actually set out a proposal to deliver a balanced budget for Reading Borough Council General Fund for the current financial year, and it reduces the call on reserves that was approved as part of the budget planning process back in February of last year. The report also details underspends on the housing revenue account and the capital programme, and as I said earlier, it includes details of our performance measures, which is set out in section 10 of this report and appendix 2 as well. So the report itself includes, the appendix to the report includes the recommendations that were then approved by policy committee back in December. Happy to take any questions.
Well, I think really if we were keen to see this, to bring us up to date with what's going on rather than be very retrospective in terms of audit. And I suppose obviously we're concerned about the 8.1 million overspend, but then we understand how that's being resolved, which is reassuring. We also, I think, recognise it's been an incredibly turbulent period, and just about imagine month by month you can't predict income, expenditure, and so on. So to get to a balanced position this year, I think is great. We appreciate the growing concern. Obviously, it's next, 22-23 in terms of setting budget for that. Questions from anybody? Yeah.
I guess we can't really debate this because it's been through policy, but just to note my feelings is that just as important as almost as important as an overspend on revenue, underspends on capital programs mean that things didn't get done that we had previously decided were good things to do. They're not just, it's not just, hooray, we've not spent it. They will be HRA underspend will be homes not refurbished or things like that. I don't know the detail, but capital program will be things capital expenditure on parks or on wherever that we weren't able to do. Now, presumably that's impact of COVID, probably on suppliers and on the workforce, and that's understandable. But it's worth noting that that's that's where we are.
No, it's a good observation, isn't it? Things we'd like to have done, haven't done. I mean, the big ones, the new sports centres, the swimming pools are still going apace, aren't they? And I suppose one question, what did we save by virtue of sliding the capital programme right? What have we saved in terms of borrowing costs? I mean, I'm sure it's in the table, but I don't know if you know roughly off the top of your head.
Yeah, apologies, I don't know.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Off the top of my
So
head.
that's a fair question.
I agree with the comments that it is important to get our forecasting right on capital programme, because we do have to make revenue provision for it as well. Plus, any slippage means that we're not delivering projects on time, and we do need to get better at both the forecasting and the delivery of our capital programme.
I have just found, actually, I'm curious, Table 1, General Fund Forecast 21-22, budget for the actual capital financing costs, 15.5 million. This is forecast outturn 15.5. So it seems strange that that's having heard what we said, we haven't spent that money, therefore we haven't borrowed it, and yet the forecast is the same as the actual budget.
Yeah, the way that MRP works is you pay MRP on the capital expenditure that was incurred in the previous year. So we update our capital financing to reflect the slippage. We then set the budget based on that, and we have to pay MRP based on the expenditure that had already been incurred. So the slippage in this year's programme will impact on the level of MRP that we need to provide next financial year. So I know it's complicated.
As I say, we're gifted amateurs here. All right. Any other questions for anybody? Again, anybody on the line? Nope. Okay, well, thank you for that. That's useful. So I think we're keen that we do see these quarterly reports coming to us. So then the next one, Mr. Graham, Information Governance Quarterly Update.
Thank you, Chairman. This is another report on general progress as regards information governance, but I would like to draw members' attention to some of the statistics which we're tracking in this report and which are things which are important to the Council. So first of all, in relation to the freedom of information requests and the response from different services in the timescale of 20 days. You'll note that our overall response in Q2 was 77%, so still not where we want it to be, but on the breakdown by month, in relation to those FOIs, you'll see that there are some glimmers of hope that we're getting into the territory where we need to be. The issue appears to be consistency across departments in all the months, which is something we've got to push on. But we have got in various different departments 87% compliance, 100% compliance, 87%, 90, 92. Again, those are kind of numbers which we need, but when they're brought down by other areas where we have lower levels of compliance, that brings the general picture down to that 77%. So we do have to push forward with the FOIs, and there are a number of actions ongoing at the minute, whether they are technical or cultural, communications highlighting the issue and trying to make sure that we are keeping the focus on the FOIs. Secondly, would like to draw members' attention to the figures in relation to training. This is something which has been in members' reports for the last year. I looked back to see where we were this time last year, and we were just tracking cyber security training. And in January 21, we were 29% of staff who'd completed cyber training. With the push that we've had throughout the year, we're now up to 79%. And we've added information governance and data protection as a mandatory training item, and that's up to 63%. And there was a push on that in the autumn, and quite a significant bit of extra compliance there, because we were at 29% in September 21. So it's useful that those are going up in the right direction, but still, you know, less than 80% and less than 2/3 on those two sets of training is not where we want to be. We want to be up towards the 90% on those as well. Eagle-eyed members of the committee will spot that over the reports that I've sent to you, the number of staff has jumped around as we have refined the lists about the staff who are in and out of this training. And the more that we push, the better the information becomes on that, as ADs continually update their lists of people who are no longer employed, shouldn't be on the system, don't have full-time access to a system or even part-time access to a system. And so we've identified the cohorts of people, and you see examples there. And we've now got an offline training program to be delivered to those groups of staff in conjunction with their managers, so that we can deliver good information security training to them. Because it's not just about being at a desktop, it's also about physical security of buildings, trusting people who may be around, finding information which they may come across in the course of their building, in the course of their work in the building. Just reporting suspicious events, knowing how to report things, not taking things for granted. So all that kind of good training for people who aren't on desktops. We've got continual push on the numbers in relation to those desktop users, and we're now looking at two kinds of further work to persuade people that this really has to be done. Technical in terms of limiting their access to the system, and also managerial in terms of warning letters from HR to people who are just stubbornly resistant. So those are the two things which we're looking at. But there are some areas of staff where we have to sort of accept that they have to be given a little bit more time. So for instance, the community reablement team that works, it's shown as a section, people who have got access part-time to a system, but are only on that shared computer, you know, for a period of time, once or twice in a fortnight or a month, and they share a resource. So we have to allow for the fact that they're going to get on that system and do that training eventually. But we do have to make it important, even for people who are part-time users, to stress that they could still make a slip because they're not properly trained. So those are the that's the important information which I wanted to draw your attention to. And then just also to say that in relation to the action plan, which has been updated for the strategy, that will be coming to policy in March, and we expect the next Audit and Governance Committee to be bringing forward dashboards in relation to progress on those strategy items.
Okay, well, that's really good, because we're obviously making quite a lot of progress. It's been a hard graft, I appreciate. I've seen this before in terms of embedding these behaviours. A couple of things. FOIs, you obviously mentioned internally and where we've got to. Have we got any sense of how we compare with other authorities in terms of numbers received and then sort of turnaround times? Are we with a pack? Are we leading? Are we just trailing behind? So give us a sense of, are we where we think we should like to be on that one? I'll come back on the other training.
It's a good point. There has been some discussion amongst Berkshire monitoring officers, and there are issues across all of Berkshire about this. People have got it in their sights. I don't have figures, but it might be worth benchmarking. The 90% figure is an Information Commissioner's officer's. That is his benchmark figure for local authorities about what's acceptable. So I think that is the benchmark which we have to aim for. Obviously, 100% would be desirable.
Yeah, but so we're on 77%,
yeah,
and 90 is the target.
Yeah.
But I think it'd be helpful. So if the answer is everybody else is at 89, 90, yeah, then we've got some way to go. If they're down in the 60s, well, at least we have some comfort that relatively we're doing a good job where you are.
Yes, we did, of course, in previous meetings, give advice about the review which we had from Leicester City Council, and that's a high-performing council that's up in the 90s, so it's possible.
And just on the training, that sounds all good as say what you're driving at there. A couple of questions. Is it now embedded in all new joiner training? So all new joiners have to do it, and then will it become sort of an annual event that again people have to refresh each year?
Yes, it's mandatory for new joiners, both elements. So it's not possible to pass your probation without doing those two mandatory elements. And yes, the message has been sent out to people about the annual nature of the refresher for both of those modules. What we're currently confirming with the supplier is whether or not they're going to issue new modules this year. So people are booking in repeats of the two modules which they've taken roughly 12 months after they first did them, or whether or not we can expect to receive brand new updated modules, in which case we'll send the message to people, wait for the new modules and do the updated modules with the new information in it.
Okay, that's really pleasing. Any other comments, Councillor Gittings, then Councillor Emerson?
Well, I mean, Chair, you asked the question I was going to ask about benchmark. Because it seems obvious that in a whole range of council services, when you it's a kind of new area, isn't it? Freedom of information is not. It's something that's like come in sort of is more focus on it over the last few years. I mean, I suppose I'd make the comment that if left in terms of this level, I'd make the comment that Leicester can be at 90% odd. What are they doing that we aren't? And there's one thing in terms of the training, obviously the cyber training. It did slightly concern me that, I mean, the people who weren't regular users of the system were difficult to obviously to get the training, and I can understand why it is difficult. But those are, to be honest, maybe the sort of people, if they're not regular users of a system, that could actually make the error, rather than people who are using it regularly. So I just sort of want a reassurance that we are trying to say crack down on those people, but to really push to get it done, because it's really important, this, isn't it? One mistake can cost a council or millions and their system's locked out.
Chairman, yes, it is an important issue which we are tracking every month in the Information Governance Board, and looking particularly where we're honing in now on those areas where we have got lesser compliance, so that we can make sure that we are following those up.
I think the important thing is also, you introduce the training first, let people get used to that, then you start the sort of sanctions and the fact that I think it just creates a new culture, and so then it's just accepted that's the way we do business. And I say exactly your point, that because they're infrequent users of anything, yes, they're not regularly acting, but actually they're much almost higher risk because they're not so familiar with what they're looking at and seeing at, much more probably sort of vulnerable to phishing and the likes. Okay, a couple more. So Councillor Emerson.
Yeah, just on the point of the cybersecurity, obviously we've spoken before about councillors setting the example, hopefully, in terms of hitting 100%. And I just thought, with the local elections, will cyber training form part of the induction? Because I think that would be a really good way of getting it sort of done, rather than having stragglers as we do now.
Yes, I think it will be built in.
No space for stragglers. Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. I like the training strategy that you have. Obviously, part e-learning, part classroom-based or face-to-face training. My question is, where is this information or the reporting of that training held? Certainly within the learning system, within Learning Pool, there are records maintained. But in terms of the external training to what is regarded as e-learning, are those records being maintained in a system? Are they being put into Learning Pool, or do you have another repository for that information that can be pulled on?
At the moment, anything which is taking place as regards any kind of information governance training, FOI, data protection, etc., we have got records of those in the office through the information governance team, because we're very aware of the fact that were there to be a breach, it would be the first thing that an information commissioner investigator would ask for. Who did you train? When did you train them? So particularly when we've had any slips on data protection, with people sending things to the wrong email address that we've had to get back, or to apologise or write or clear up afterwards, those little incidents, and we've done follow-up training with the team or the individual concerned. We have records of that. The new programme in terms of those who aren't on the system, which is mentioned in the report, is being rolled out now, so there will be records kept of that. But it is important for managers to have a view about how their service is performing, which is why we're still pursuing the automatic linking of the learning pool information into the iTrent system, which managers have a dashboard on so they can see it. At the moment, these figures are being produced by some manual intervention of reporting out of one system, which is fine. It's giving us the information, it's allowing us to make a push, and it's allowing us to know where we have to take action. But we do need to make sure that we've got that automated, because I haven't got the staff resource for someone to do that, forever and a day. It's important that managers take accountability for that themselves.
Any more? I think not. Councillor McKelroy is very quiet on this stuff, so no events. Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, I think that's the one we said we've followed this story over the last couple of years now, haven't we? And it's very reassuring that we're getting there. I think it's a long way forward. So well done, and thank you for your efforts on this, Ms. Gregg. I'm conscious it's been quite a struggle for you. Okay, so next one is the Redmond review update. Mr. Carter again.
Yep, back to me. So this report updates the committee on the continued response to the Redmond review of the effectiveness of local audit. In the report, I provide details of the continuing issues, with only 9% of the 2020-21 audits being completed by the extended deadline, the factors that have led to this, and the government's proposals to address these going forward. One of the government's proposals includes asking SIPFA to publish strengthened guidance on the role of audit committees, and that is likely to consider whether audit committees become a statutory requirement and the role of independent members on audit committees. We will report back to Audit and Governance Committee with details of that guidance when it is published. I also asked the committee to agree the recommendation that the council signs up to the sector-led option for the appointment of external auditors for 5 years from 1st of April 23, in order to minimise admin costs and to take advantage of the leverage that we get from being part of a national scheme. Happy to take any questions.
So, I mean, in terms of statutory basis, presumably we were already doing that, so that's not an issue for us. In terms of independent member, I think we'd be interested to know what the criteria, what the actual job spec would look like, and how they might be selected and all the rest. Because I think generally can see the benefits of that, but I would have some questions about the sense of their accountability and what their role and what they contribute, what the additional benefit might be.
Yeah, so it will be interesting to see what SIPFA conclude on this. I mean, I've previously had 3 independent members on an audit committee that I was involved with. So, and actually the reason we had 3 is because we went out to advert. We had so many good applicants that we decided to increase the number of independent members of the committee with the approval of the chair. But that clearly this will all depend on what the guidance actually says, and whether the guidance becomes a statutory requirement or whether it just remains guidance for audit committees.
Yeah, so we don't have a choice. Yeah. And one of the things I think we picked this up was the fact that when we looked for external, I think non-exec directors of running buses, there was a massive response, wasn't there? There seemed an appetite. It might be the massive remuneration they were going to receive if they were appointed, but the point was there seemed to be an appetite out there for people to get involved with local, and so it strikes me that I would suspect we'll find ready candidates to do it, which is good. Yeah. And the other thought I had, and maybe EY should close their ears if they're listening, is assuming that we go ahead with the government scheme of then choosing auditor, would we have any sort of preference? Because I mean, I guess having settled in with one external audit, it'd be a pain to then have to sort of start the new one again.
It will be run by the PSAA, and we're allowed to include a preference if we wish to, but that wouldn't necessarily have any influence on the decision-making process of PSAA. One thing we've discussed in the Berkshire Section 151 officers is that there might be a benefit across Berkshire if we all have the same external auditors because of the benefit that that would give with the, well, in lots of ways, but especially with the pension fund audits. So I will be bringing, subject to approval tonight, I'll be bringing a report to council in February, because it's a council decision around this, so I'll need a formal council minute to support that. But I will probably recommend that we request a single auditor across Berkshire going forward.
How many different auditors are there currently?
Well, at the moment, my understanding is that there are only 3 audit firms in the market.
Correct.
At the moment, and that's the issue that we've got, because the capacity in the market simply isn't there. And the government's proposals outline ideas for how we can increase the number of firms involved in the audit of local authority accounts.
I suppose the point was there's 6 6 unitaries in Berkshire. How many different auditors?
Oh, sorry. I think 5 of us have got the same.
Oh, so hopefully,
one other. Right.
So yeah, that's helpful. Right.
Sorry.
Okay. Any more on Redmond? No. So we're agreeing the recommendation to adopt the PSSA's invitation to opt in. So I guess that's what you're asking us to do, which I think we are approving. But you've still got to go to full council to get that. Yeah. But you can take our recommendation to full council. So that's a bit of leverage there. They'll listen to what we're telling them. Right. So then the next one, we're getting there. Item 11, implementation of audit recommendations tracker. Oh, right, I'm looking in the wrong place. Mr. Carter again. No? No. Oh, I'm so sorry. What, Director of Resources? I beg your pardon, Deputy Chief Executive, sorry.
Fine. So, Chair, this is the standard report that comes to each meeting now, setting out the current outstanding audit recommendations in Appendix 1. Paragraph 4.6 indicates the change since the last report and the status in summary terms of those recommendations in Appendix 1. So you can see that currently there are 23 green recommendations, 38%, 11 and 18% of those are reported as complete. There are 52% amber, so 32 recommendations amber and 6 recommendations that are red. The overall position from a trend perspective and previous reporting period is a slight improvement, with an increase in the number of green recommendations and a decrease in the number of red recommendations. The amber recommendation percentage has stayed the same. I do note in paragraph 4.7 that there are a number of recommendations in the appendix that are now more than 12 months old. There are about 23, 24 off the top of my head. And between now and the next meeting, I will be making a concerted effort to get people's attention moved to those, to move them on. So some are reporting as green, but are not yet complete, and so it's what do we need to do to get those over the line. Others of them are red or amber, so there will be a push on those particular recommendations that are over 12 months old in the next quarter.
Okay, so that's a sort of slightly improving picture. Councillor McKeown, do you want to go first?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for to the officers for the work on this. I personally find it a bit difficult to process all of the information that is there, and ultimately with the way it's written, kind of have to take officers' word that things are moving in the right direction, which I definitely think they probably are. With specific reference to 4.8, which is on page 146 and 7, I mean, from the graph, if you look at the trend over time since March 21, things are at best, not changing, and you could even argue that they're getting worse. And I guess my question is, do you agree, and could you explain your answer, please? Because I suspect the answer is no, you don't agree, and that there's a reason for that, and I'd like to just hear that, if that's okay. Thank you.
Just before the officers answer, what I will say is, for those of us who've been involved in this for some time, officers have grappled over a number of years as to how best to try and present this information to us. We've asked for it, rightly. We've struggled, and it's iterative, and so progressively they've tried to present it more and more clearly. It is not, as a massive information, it's not an easy thing to present. If you have ideas as how to think it might be better done, don't hold back, because we've each time tried to sort of get to the point where it's understandable, but we accept that it's not the easiest thing to digest, as you're saying. So there's no aversion to trying and improve it, but this has been the journey thus far to get it to this state even. Sorry, do you want to carry on?
Great.
Thank you, Chair. I think my reflection would be that we are never going to be in a position where there are no audit recommendations outstanding. The nature of the audit plan is that there are a significant number of audits that happen over the course of the year and each quarter, and each of those will, I am absolutely sure, generate some recommendations. If, as we've heard tonight, we come up with against particular issues, they will generate more recommendations than others. The audit process itself is about providing assurance and improving our governance. So I think the fact that, you know, we are identifying things is fine. It is about how quickly we act to put in the remediation and make sure that those situations don't repeat. So that's what we've been working on over the last 2 or 3 years. In overall terms, I think if you went back to where we started with this process, then the volume of recommendations has absolutely come down. I take your point around 4.8, and it may be about how that's presented, because it's done in percentage terms, and so it looks as though there's not a huge amount of change around the amber, although the red has come down, and you know it's flipping between the amber and the green. So I do take that on board, but I think it is about making sure that we're turning the recommendations around really quickly, and that we are seeing improvements in the level of assurance reports that we're getting. So you know, to have a no assurance report is very, very unusual. And actually what we want to be seeing is more reports that are providing reasonable or good assurance levels rather than at the lower end.
And just to add to that, Bill, I think we're sort of, it's a dynamic thing. So fast as people are actually rectifying and implementing recommendations, bless him, Mr. Harrington is coming up with new recommendations. So as fast as you're emptying the barrel, somebody's filling it at the top. So that's why it's a very difficult thing to present in terms of a dynamic report. I think the one, I'm not sure I've got a page number, but after 4.8 and at 5, it admits it's in percentages, but the fact that when we started off, you know, 20%, almost a fifth of the recommendations were red, and now we're getting down to 10. I think that's quite helpful over 2 years. But the point being that you say you'll never get there, because there are constantly, as Mrs. Yates says, there's constantly new recommendations being made. It's almost, can you sort of rectify or at least implement faster than they're coming down the line? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I echo really what Councillor McElroy said, and this is quite an important. This is probably, well, it's probably possibly the most important thing in this meeting, because having a recommendation factory, Mr. Harrington is the one thing. He's working the supply side, but in terms of consuming the recommendations, as in implementing them, if they don't get implemented, there's little point in identifying them. So it's really, really important, and we do this debate a number of times how to track them. I wonder, you know, I mean, there are still 61 outstanding. That's not an insignificant number, so it's worth noting that. And the other thing is, I was going to ask, is it someone's job to chase these, or is it the leadership of the relevant department or directorate to be trusted that they've got an outstanding list somewhere on their inbox and they need to work through it, and they report to you essentially every quarter or whatever? Is someone constantly on top of them chasing that?
So fundamentally, it is the responsibility of the officer identified as responsible for implementing that recommendation to implement that recommendation, and the management chain to make sure that that happens. In order to produce this information, then there is somebody corporately who is picking up all of the new recommendations, who is liaising with those recommendation owners, and it is the recommendation owners who are providing the narrative. Now, I entirely accept that sometimes it is difficult to see what has shifted from one period to another. And again, I'm happy to go away and talk to officers to make sure that rather than just cross-referencing recommendations or providing the same response as they did last time, we see what the incremental improvement is towards that. So that is something we can do next time to make it clearer.
Again, it's just worth just rehearsing the history of this as to why we're doing what's important. As you rightly say, because a couple of years back, the issue was Mr. Harrington was reporting, making recommendations. They weren't really being picked up on. Nobody was doing anything much about them. And there was a sense, well, what the hell's the point of making all these recommendations? Nothing happens to them. Hence, we got this report coming to us. And then progressively, what we've tried to do is improve the presentation, the actual, the way in which it's presented, so that we can understand and see. So I think it's still work in progress. But what is happening now is there's this focus on it, so that these recommendations aren't just being lost. The reporting's coming through, and obviously management is then having to sort of explain why they're not implementing. So I feel it's, you know, that we're well on the way on that journey now.
I think implementing this reporting has been quite important in raising the profile of the audit recommendations. It is certainly much better in terms of responsiveness than it was historically, and I think Paul and his team would concur with that. It gets far more visibility, so that is positive. You know, in terms of how we report what we report, we can always make improvements, of course we can. I think the other thing to say to the committee is, if there are particular areas that are not moving forward, then it is at the discretion of the committee, as we saw this evening, to invite those officers responsible and the assistant directors in for those areas to understand why things haven't moved as quickly as they might have done. So that is at the discretion of the committee.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think the Deputy Chief Exec alluded to it and referred to the narratives, and for me, I completely get Councillor McElroy's point, and I find the narratives to be one of the most beneficial parts of the audit tracker, and in terms of explaining where we are. And I think from my time on the committee, they have improved, where they are changed each time, and we now have a box that says when they were last updated, and it just makes a real difference. You know, for example, on the HRA lines, colleagues will remember the recommendations associated there, and from reading the narratives, you will see that we have a new permanent strategic business partner for the HRA, and you know, that's not something that would form part of the headline in terms of the direction, which is really important. But you know, reading into it and looking at the narratives, you can kind of get a better context of the environment officers are in terms of looking at getting those recommendations done. So just, I think the narratives are one of the most important parts, as well as the headline.
Anybody else? So just to reiterate, I mean, I think this has come a long way from where I remember it being a few years back, and so I think this is good, but this isn't the end of the story. Equally, this shouldn't become an industry in itself, just populating a table. The point is that actions come out of this. This is merely recording it. But my point is this: if anybody thinks there's a better way of doing it, or improve the presentation such that it improves more action, don't hesitate. I think officers are very receptive. So what we don't want to do is constantly every meeting come up with new changes and it becomes an industry just in the table itself. That's not the objective. But in terms of actually achieving actions, I think we've come a long way, and I think again I'm very happy to sort of keep the journey going. Number 11. So closing financial accounts is item 12. Let's just go into this. Mr. Carter, again, it's a one-man show, or nearly.
A quality there. So this report updates members of the committee on the progress for the audit of the 2019-20 accounts. The draft accounts were published on the 10th of December last year, and a considerable amount of audit work has been done over the last couple of months, and I provide some headline details of that work in the report. In previous years at this point, we had identified a significant number of adjusting items that would need to be changed in the final accounts. So far this year, we've only found one such item. So that does signify a good trajectory in terms of direction of travel. Colleagues from EY will provide their own update on the progress of the audit in the next agenda item, so I'll leave them to do that. But just to reassure members of the committee, Stuart and myself both meet with EY twice weekly to go through the progress of the audit. We had a nice catch-up earlier today with Adrian and Francis from EY to make sure that we're on top of the detail and that any audit queries that come through are addressed as soon as we become aware of them. And it also gives us the opportunity to clarify our understanding of any queries as soon as they're raised with us. So we all make sure that we understand the nature of the query and what we need to do to respond. So we're doing that twice a week at the moment, and that's working successfully. In the background, we're also working on producing the 2020-21 draft statement with the intention that that will be ready for publication once the audit of the 1920 accounts has been concluded. The report also provides members with an update of the current staffing situation on the team. Members of the committee will probably be aware of the former Chief Accountant, Annette Trigg. She has now left the council to take up a new role, a role at a different council, and I want to put on record my thanks to Annette for all the hard work that she did on behalf of RBC. We've appointed an experienced interim Chief Accountant, Joe Nacey, to cover that role for the next couple of months, and we've managed to make a very encouraging permanent appointment of Mark Sanders, who's currently Chief Accountant at Worcestershire County Council, and he will be joining us in March. So while it was disappointing to lose Annette, I think we've made a good, strong appointment there with Mark. And apologies, something else I should have said in the report that Councillor Emberson just reminded me about. Since the last committee, we've also got 2 new permanent strategic finance business partners in post. Steve MacDonald, who's leading on DEN's directorate, and Claire Gavigan, who's leading on DAX. 2 extremely capable, experienced individuals who are permanent appointments, and it's the first time those 2 posts have been covered by permanent appointments for quite a considerable time. So we are making progress in terms of putting in place a permanent senior staffing structure within the team. So I'm happy to take any questions, but of course this directly links to the next agenda item as well, which is EY's update on the audit plan.
And just to be clear, and apologies if it's in the report, I haven't got a grasp of it, you've done as much as you can now do to 1920, they're published, you're just merely responding to any questions the auditor has about them. Of course, we're still doing our own checks and reviews of 1920 in the background to make sure that if we identify anything, then of course we will discuss that with the auditors. But essentially what's happening now is they've received all of the information and they're sending us questions based on the information that they've received, right, and we are responding to those questions. So we're hearing, as you rightly say, about their progress on 1920, and then hopefully, so yeah, it's. So I mean, they've set up a portal, so every time they require information from us, the details of that inquiry are held on the portal. We then submit our response to that on the portal,
and they then update that and provide Stuart, myself, with a regular update of the number of issues that they've raised or questions that they've raised, and the success or otherwise in us answering those questions to their satisfaction. It's working well at the moment. There are a couple of items that have failed their testing at the moment, and actually Stuart's working on doing a response to those at the moment, but touch wood, we haven't identified anything significant yet as part of the audit. As part of today's meeting, we did receive some feedback about a technical evaluation of our valuations, which I haven't yet updated Jackie on. But there are a couple of questions that have come out of that work that we've now passed on to our valuers for them to respond, which is exactly the way that the process is designed to work.
Okay, super. So thank you for that. Questions from members of the committee? None. Councillor McCurry, I think you've got a comment or a question.
No, sorry, miscommunication. If so, I'm fine. Thanks.
Okay, you flashed up on my screen momentarily. I thought you had a question there. All right, so that's pleasing to hear where you've got to. I suppose importantly now, the next question is item 13, and we go to the draft audit planning report from EY as to hear how they're getting on with things. So it's Maria. Good, super to see you.
Hi, thank you. So yes, I'll hand over to Adrian in a moment to take you through the plan. So we're slightly back to front tonight because we've just heard about the progress on the audit, but actually ordinarily you would get a plan before we start our audit work, and then we would complete the audit work and then we'd report. Because we've worked incredibly hard with your teams to follow on from having signed last year's or the previous year's statements in October to then, as we'd committed to you, that we would then crack on in November. We have, as you've just heard, worked through a lot of our audit over the last month or so. We still clearly have audit work to crack on with and complete, but we clearly still need to bring the plan to you for this year and to talk that through with you as those charged with governance. So, and the reason we're doing it this way is because in order to catch you up, we need to deliver a year's audit in less than a year for each of this year, next year, and the year after. And so we're not spreading things out, you know, bringing the plan, then waiting a couple of months, and bringing the next thing, and then we're pretty much doing everything as quickly as we possibly can. So I just wanted to explain that because it's a bit unusual to obviously hear about the work that's that's been undertaken, sorry, and then to get the plan telling you what we're planning to do at this stage. From the point of view of everything that Mr. Carter said, I just concur. I think the team's working incredibly well together. You can see from the list in the report that you've just seen that the amount of work that has been completed already, which is, you know, which has gone at a pace, and I think we've all got our foot absolutely flat to the floor on this one to keep the momentum going. If I can then hand over, if that's okay with the committee, to Adrian to talk you through that plan, because we do have a requirement to make sure you're cited on key elements of our plan, and then we'll happily take questions.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. So probably just a couple of key elements of the plan I'd just like to kind of highlight to the committee. So if we could just take the report on page 171 and 172. So this highlights our consideration of significant risks and inherent risks. And there's probably just three areas I'd like to talk the committee through on pages 171 and 172. So one is our significant risk around property, plant and equipment. So that's a change in our risk assessment from the prior year, and primarily that's driven by an assessment of the significance of that balance, but also the impact of COVID as well. COVID kind of impacted on the first quarter back in March 2020, and we saw quite a significant impact on property valuations across a number of sectors, including retail, which obviously the council's involved with through the Oracle. So as part of that, and consistent with the work that we completed across most of our other clients across local government, we decided to use our internal valuation specialist to complete some assessments. So we have a sample of assets, and as Mr. Carter said, They've done that review and they're primarily happy with the majority of those assets and have a number of questions on some, which the council are now working through with their external valuers. And then just on page 172, we talk about the change in risks around the cash position. So previously we've talked about some of the cash reconciliation issues we've identified, and actually for 1920 we decided to include a new inherent risk around the cash process, which we're currently working through. And then the final change flagged red was around the reporting for Reading Transport Limited. So there was a change in their accounting period. So we just wanted to make sure that actually everything that should have gone through has gone through in the correct manner. So again, when we report back through our audit results report, we'll be able to give an update on all of these risks, and indeed if there's any changes to the risk assessment as we go through the audit. Just a couple of other considerations quickly was around our consideration materiality on page 173, 174. So it just details the values we're working to in terms of our materiality for our testing purposes. And again, it's consistent with prior years at 1% and 50%. So no real change there. On page 183 and 184, we talked through the value for money assessment and conclusion. So again, that details our risk assessment. And for members of the committee who've been here for a while, you'll be familiar with the kind of previous qualifications we've had in that area. And some of that's been driven by Ofsted inspections. And again, we need to kind of make sure that's relevant because we're still reflecting on the 2019-20 period. And I think that's probably the only other thing to say is around our use of specialists, actually, on page 194. So I've already talked about the use of our internal valuation specialists. We're also using our internal PFI specialist to look at the PFI models for your waste and housing models, and he's reported back on initial assessment of those. And lastly, we'll be using our EY actuarial specialist to support our assessment of the pension liability. So again, as another significant balance, we need to do some quite significant work on that. So those are the three internal specialists we'll be using, and two of those are slightly changed from the previous year. As in, we'll be using our internal valuation specialist from property and also our PFI specialist. I'll probably stop there actually, and happy to take any questions.
Members of the committee. So I suppose it's a very simple question, but if everything goes to plan and we're on track, when would we hope to sort of be getting to the end and you giving an opinion on 1920? So I appreciate there's lots of variables.
Yeah, so we do have an indicative timeline within the report. I think probably at previous committees we've talked about how the trajectory of the audits have gone from 16-17. So again, for members who've been around for a while, so in 2016-17 the audit took 32 months. The 17-18 audit took about 18 months. We then moved down to 12 months for 18-19, and if we're on the current trajectory in terms of April or May, we'll now be down to 8 or 9 months for completion of that audit. So that's a kind of very considerable improvement, obviously, in terms of the amount of effort and commitment that's gone in from both sides. So that's really positive, and I think, you know, as Mr. Carter has said, we've kind of worked well together as teams to kind of build up that relationship and trying to resolve queries as quickly as possible. So again, if we could get to April or May, that would be, you know, 8 or 9 months for that particular 1920 accounts, and then obviously we'd have to consider the 2021 accounts. But actually, and I suppose the context that we talked about or was referenced in the Redmond report is probably relevant as well. So actually, that would probably take the council beyond a number of other councils. So previously, whereas Reading was possibly an outlier in terms of where they were, I think that position would certainly move them beyond some other councils. So I think that's all very positive in terms of trying to do that. But obviously, we still have quite a lot of work to get through before then. But certainly April or May is probably realistic based on what we've already done to date.
No, that's really very pleasing to hear. And as you rightly said, this is a trajectory. So hopefully, you know, the following year, and by about 25, 26, 27, it'll be about 2 months, and that's it. Job done, right? Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Any more? Yeah. So both of you. Okay, you go first, Richard.
Thanks. A simple question, really. I guess on page 6, you talk about the areas of risk and focus. There's a couple of new areas of focus there. Did they just accumulate, or have we dropped any others? Is there a reason why things come up on there? Is it what you've noticed from previous audits, or just what's going on in the world that might impact us?
Yeah, so I think, do you want me to go, Maria, or do you want to go?
No, you go.
So I think there has been some come off the list, actually. So previously we would have reported issues around where we had previously qualified accounts. And obviously, in the last few years, we've moved away from having those qualified areas, which has meant, you know, a considerable amount of work in the areas that have been qualified, and also a kind of a higher risk assessment across our audit. So it's positive from the point of view that we've been able to move away from those. I think the fact that we brought the significant risk in around property, plant and equipment was probably nothing to do with the council. It was actually the environment in terms of COVID, and actually what we saw in the marketplace was kind of wild fluctuations in some of the valuations, and actually there was a lack of reliable data for valuers to be able to do accurate valuations. They used a number of indices which are based on trends and market sales, and actually they didn't have that information. So actually across all of our clients in local government, you probably see a similar risk. So, and it's also useful for us to bring in our specialists. We used them about 2-3 years ago just to kind of update our risk assessment and support us. The other two are kind of quite specific. So I think cash has been something that we've messaged, and also internal audit have messaged. So probably not unsurprising that that's still something that we're kind of looking at. And then the group was kind of a specific one that changed as a result of previously the RTL accounts were out of sync with the council accounts, and the fact that they reported it September. So the fact we were trying to bring them in line kind of aligned and made the audit process smoother, because we didn't have to do additional processes in the 6-month interim period.
And I think it's fair to say that each year, you know, we will step back and reassess those risks. And as Adrian says, some of them will fall away. There may be some new ones due to current year issues. There are some areas where we will always consider risk based on auditing standards. So there's always going to be consideration of a risk around revenue and expenditure recognition, and that's driven by the standards. And we also have management override as a kind of significant risk area that is embedded in our approach, and that's purely around auditor independence and making sure that we remain sceptical around obviously management overriding controls. So there are some standard ones you'll see every year, and then there are some that are specific to the council and some that are environmental outside of the council.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pleased to see that we're, you know, obviously that the catch up is catching up fast, because obviously members of this committee, you know, as you know in the past, and obviously it's been in the local media, been immensely frustrated, and you know, it's not been a question of sort of a general portion blame, and it's good to see that lessons have been learned. So I think in the previous item we were talking about Leicester being top of the information governance table. Let's hope that, you know, perhaps by 25-26. Reading's the top of the audit table, and obviously we made a remark so off mic there that could that lead to a reduction in the overall bill, because in a serious note, you know, the financial side of this has been, you know, has been well rehearsed in the local media, and you know, people think that you're spending sort of millions more on the audit than you need to. So I suppose I've got two questions. One, will the lessons learned help us, you know, have a smaller bill, lesser financial liability in later years? And the other area, I think a number of councils seem to have got into trouble, I'm not going to mention their names, by their assessment of what the value of their financial assets. Is Reading under any risk of that? And also, I'm slightly puzzled in the sense that as we're doing retrospective accounts for 1920, that evaluation made then in a different market that can then count against you, you know, but based on current conditions because of COVID.
So I think if I take the first question, then I'll ask Adrian to just make some comments around valuation of assets. But from the point of view of the first question, and can lessons help reduce the fee? The fee has reduced each year since the 16-17 year, in that we've had to, obviously as we've qualified the accounts in previous years, we've had to do additional work in each of those years, and that has reduced each year as we've been able to get more assurance. During the first couple of years, there were lots of issues with kind of the records and the supporting documentation that was available. And what Mrs. Yates and her team have done is, as we've identified issues, they've worked hard to undertake a kind of a sweep of the kind of records in those areas and make sure that they're improved, and that's now coming through to fruition. So if you look at the the samples that are in Mr. Carter's report and the error rates within them, that's very different to where we were in the accounts 2 years ago, where we were pulling samples and having very high error rates. So that improvement has resulted in a reduction in time and therefore fee. Where the fee actually reduces to, we can't comment at this point, because there's always increased regulation and other requirements, and audit fees are clearly the thing of much larger discussions centrally at the moment. But certainly those lessons learned and improvements are currently playing out in the fees coming down each year at the moment. Adrian, did you want to pick up the point about the asset valuation point for this particular year?
Yeah, I think just before I do that, I think the other point probably Maria is just in the Redmond paper was also the support the central government are given to councils to support the increased regulation and the audit process. I think there's a recognition that it's become very difficult, and actually kind of as Mr. Carter reported in his report, the number of councils who made the deadline back in September was only 9% nationally. So there is a recognition that there is additional support needs to go into that. So I think the government have committed now 45 million over the next 3 years to do that. Just in terms of the valuation point, so it's probably just for the sake of the committee. So the valuations in the accounts we're currently looking at, the balance sheet date is the 31st of March 2020. And obviously COVID was impacted in March 2020. So the valuations that the valuers would be attributed to those particular assets would be kind of at that point in time. So that's kind of why that was significant. Obviously, from the council's point of view, where you have investment properties and you have a significant investment property portfolio, you wouldn't want a significant deterioration in your investment property for the reasons, obviously, that a number of them are generating revenue, which the council can then, they're building into their longer term medium plans. So I think there's a number of different points around assets, but it's probably just beneficial for the committee to remember that, we're valuing the assets as at the 31st of March 2020 and the conditions that were kind of active at that time.
It's pandemic, isn't it? So what they were worth then, I suppose now, but yes, okay. Any more questions, any more thoughts? No. Okay, well, as ever, we really appreciate the involvement of our external auditors and the fact you've sat through the whole meeting and listened to all of us talking, but it's great. And I think what we're really pleased to hear, obviously, is this direction of travel, the fact that it is reducing, everything is improving. And so hopefully we're going to catch up over the next year or so, which is, I think that's the ambition, isn't it? I'm sure we will. I'm sure we will. So thank you very much, both Maria and Adrian. So I think that brings us to what is effectively the last item. And just to make sure everybody understand what's going on here, both item 14 and 16 is effectively the same item. We're going to discuss housing benefit and council tax support scheme, but particularly the risk-based verification policy. So we can start, and indeed we can conclude the whole thing in open meeting if we don't get into the detail of the way in which we go about verifying. For fairly obvious reasons, we would not want that to be in the public domain. So if people are happy, we can stay as we are in the sort of open public meeting. If people want to get into the detail about the policy itself, which should be on blue papers, then I'll call a halt. We'll have to clear the room of media and go offline, and then conclude in camera in confidential meeting. So hopefully we can do it all publicly, but we'll see how we go on if people are happy with that. Okay, and I think looks like Samantha's going to introduce this.
Good evening, thank you, Chair. So this report proposes the continued use of the Council's risk-based verification process for the next financial year, and that's to mitigate fraud and error and reduce the risk of subsidy loss in the housing benefit and council tax support application process. The policy's been reviewed. Whilst there are changes to the council tax support scheme from the 1st of April 22, these have no impact and the policy remains identical to the previous year, but it is considered good practice for the policy to be examined by yourselves and agreed annually. It should be noted that as a result of COVID, we continue to adopt the principle of trust and protect to support the safety of claimants and local authority colleagues in line with the DWP guidance. So thank you, and I welcome any questions.
I mean, from my point of view, this first public bit really is debating whether it's a good idea to have a risk-based verification policy, isn't it? And the following items are debating what it should consist of. But I think from my point of view, I think it's very sensible to have one, and it's not changing. So I don't feel the need to go any further.
Very good. Okay, anybody else? So I think we're all happy with the approach as currently adopted. So what we're asked to do, we're asked to basically agree the policy is set out. So I think if we're happy, we will agree it. So very straightforward for you. So thank you for waiting to the very end of the evening, Samantha. That's good of you. Okay, so I think with that, that is it. We're done. So thank you very much. We're about 2 hours worth, but I think it's a good. It's not as long as a Labour group meeting. Thank you very much, officers, as ever. Thank you much, external auditors. Sorry? Of course. Practice. Thank you all for coming. Okay, then good night.
Thank you, Chairman. Good night.